What's the best single speed tensioner? This is probably one of the most common questions people ask after how to convert to single speed. In this video, I'll go over some of the common recommendations people usually have, and I'll try to collect a lot of notes and tips that I got from people from various sources. So in general, one of the common types of tensioners people usually recommend is a rear single pulley tensioner. Some of these come either with or without springs, and they're relatively cheap for chain tensioners. As you can see, they come with a single pulley wheel, which will either push the chain upwards towards your chain stays or push it downwards. I had this kind, and it worked kind of well for a relatively good amount of time. The con, at least in my case, was that with the adjustment here, eventually it started to fatigue. There's this kind of metal rod here, and it simply started to fatigue in my case and didn't work so well. Another very common tensioner is from DMR. This kind of tensioner doesn't have any spring, and that's actually, some people think that's a con, because the tensioner won't automatically create more tension as the chain wears. But this is also a pro because you don't have a spring that will fatigue over time. I really like this tensioner, but the only reason I didn't decide to try it out is at least the current model, it works only with quick release. So if your bike has through axles, it won't be an option for you. The next option that a lot of people highly recommend is the Surly Singulator. And first of all, Surly is a big brand, and they invest a lot of time and effort in single speed. And one of the pros this tensioner has, at least over the cheaper Chinese one, is it comes with two kinds of spring, and you can set the spring to actually push the chain upwards towards your chainstay, and this is better because you'll get more chain wrap if you do that. So the second kind of tensioners I wanted to talk with you about is a ISCG chain guide tensioner with a pulley wheel or something to create the tension. So a few general notes about these kinds of tensioners is first, in terms of installation, they require a bit more technical knowledge and maybe a bit more tooling, because you will need to know how to install and remove and install your cranks. It's not super complicated, but it's something that you will need to do if you decide to install them yourself. And the second point, which is kind of obvious, they work on frames with ISCG tabs. So this model comes together with an adapter, but I'm not sure how good that would work. So that's also something you could consider. I decided to give this model a try. It's simply, I was attracted by the relatively cheap price, and it looked good enough for what I needed. And some notes about it. The first thing is this model can actually only push the chain upwards towards your chainstays, because there's a little plastic here that will prevent you from using it as pushing the chain downwards. But a very nice feature I discovered is actually this pulley wheel. It can slide here a few millimeters. And actually what this allowed me to do is to adjust the tension on my chain tensioner without having to rotate the whole chain guide, which is very nice. And the second common, the second common tensioner, the Black Spire Stinger, it's a bit more pricier, but still relatively cheap, and it's a lot more minimalistic, at least in comparison to this one. Probably weighs less, and it can either pull the chain up or push it down. The only thing, and I'm guessing here a bit, is it will require your chain to have less slack in it, because if it has a lot of slack, there's more chances it will hit your chainstays, because unlike this model, you can't adjust the tension and allow the chain to travel more around the pulley to prevent that. So now we're going into the realm of dual pulley chain tensioners. So you can see there are quite a lot of options. And in general, I'd say you would probably consider one of these tensioners if you're running a full suspension single speed bike. That's not saying you couldn't do it on a hardtail. It's usually these kind of tensioners, they actually work pretty well. They're a bit more robust. The springs on them are much more stronger than the strings you'll find on the cheap tensioners. But in terms of aesthetics, they really look like a derailleur. In some cases, they are a derailleur. So starting from the cheapest one to the more expensive, Shimano Alpine. So the reason I didn't consider this for very long is it doesn't have a lot of adjustment. So it basically, the only adjustment you have, from what I read at least, is just using some spacers. So it might be hard getting it to work with a bike that has a boost hub on it. The second tensioner, that this one looked really promising, and I actually wanted to order it, but I never managed to find anybody that would ship it to my country. It is boost compatible. It looks very promising. Another option a lot of people go through is just a derailleur. If you already have one or an old one, so it's free. They're actually pretty strong, and I've read a lot of people, especially with a full suspension bike, that say that the spring on these is a lot stronger than all the rest of the tensioners. And even if you decide to buy a cheap short cage road derailleur, or even like a Shimano Z short cage, it's not too expensive. And going like to the top end model, the Paul Melvin, it's around $100. I know a lot of people really like this kind of tensioner. It has like, I haven't experienced it myself, but people say it's like something you buy once and it's basically good to go, not something that will fall apart too soon. I'm not entirely sure. Again, I think it suffers a bit from the same issue the Shimano Alpine may have, in terms of not having enough ability to adjust the chainline. So eccentric bottom bracket or hubs. So in general, you can see we're starting to jump up in the price point here. I think you could also say, in terms of aesthetics, these kind of solutions look very, very nice. They're like the closest to converting a vertical dropout frame to looking like a true single speed with sliding dropouts. One of the reasons I didn't, well, I might still want to check them out, but one of the things that keeps deterring me from checking them is the relatively high price. So I keep saying to myself, if I'm going to spend so much money on a chain tensioner, maybe I should simply save it and wait till I decide to get a dedicated frame. But aside from that, if you have like a custom frame that you have built, or some really special bike that you can't easily replace, I think this could still be a good option to consider. There are a few things I'd like to note here. So first, in terms of adjustment, they don't give a whole lot of range. So it's not like sliding dropouts. And what this essentially means, it's you're still going to have to find gear ratios, or you're still going to be limited to gear ratios that are within relatively close to your magic gear. And then as the chain wears, you will going to be using the eccentric, either kind of eccentric device in order to create the tension. And how these works is basically the bottom bracket or the hub, they have a certain degree of movement here. So as you move the bottom bracket, in this case, as you move it around, it either takes the crank closer or further away from the rear wheel. Actually, in this case, it can also bring it up or down, so higher or lower your BB height, so that also affects your geometry. And in terms, so these two models are for a threaded bottom bracket, and this kind of solution, the White Industries, this kind of solution is based on the rear wheel hub, And again, I didn't consider it because the price is very high, even though I believe the quality of the product is probably very high. And also, this can't support a modern frame with boost, so it wasn't relevant, at least in my case. So Magic Gear, this always looks really good, and you'll have people recommending it when you're asked which chain tensioner should I get. So some people will tell you, you don't need a tensioner, just find out what's the Magic Gear for your bike. And some things to note here with this kind of chain devices is the chain stretches as time goes by. And obviously, as it will stretch, the effectiveness of this will be lower and lower. You need to also account that it's less flexible. So for a given vertical dropout frame with a given chain stay length, there's only a limited amount of gear ratios that will work. And those might not actually be the gear ratios that suit your fitness or your terrain the best. So it's it's about luck a bit. So a half link chain will let you get closer to the Magic Gear. It's not a chain tensioner, but it is something a lot of people will tell you you can try out in order to maybe be able to run a Magic Gear. The only problem with these kinds of chains, they can't work with a narrow wide chain ring. So at least for my kind of crank arm, I wasn't able to find anything that wasn't narrow wide. They're a bit heavier, they're harder to fix, and that's why I didn't consider them in my case. So obviously a dedicated single speed frame, it's not a tensioner, but it's something you could consider if you don't mind spending a bit more money and if you're really hooked onto single speed. So I know, at least in my case, I guess my next bike will probably be a dedicated single speed, and these are a few of the models I'm actually really looking on or really interested in. And the pros, obviously, with a dedicated frame is this kind of mechanism of at least sliding dropout, as you can see here. This allows maximum adjustability for running a wide range of gear ratios if you want to play and explore with that. And of course, it's less moving parts, less things that are prone to break.